And yeah, we're live.
Okay.
So Amy, you want to start?
Yeah, great. So hi, my name's Amy Berg, for those of you who haven't met me yet, or those of you who are on the internet. I'm a sixth-year grad student at UCSD. I study political philosophy and ethics, and today we're going to be talking about writing samples. So for those of you who are not here, we have several files. So the PowerPoint presentation that you may or may not be able to see very well behind me, and then also later in the program we're going to be talking about some sample writing samples. Those things are in a link that I think Rick has put up on the Hangout and on YouTube, but in case you don't have it, it's at a URL amyberg.com/SPWP, so amyberg.com/SPWP. So you can follow along there. Okay, otherwise let's get started. So we're going to talk about writing samples today, and we're going to do this in a few different ways. So first, I'm going to talk about the process of coming up with a writing sample, the steps that might be involved. Then I polled some people who have frequently been on admissions committees at UCSD. They gave me some thoughts about what they like to see, what they don't like to see in writing samples, so we're going to go over some of the things that they said. Then, if time permits, we're going to breeze through some additional writing resources that may or may not be helpful to you now, but will probably be helpful to you if you embark on big writing projects later, like a dissertation. And then at the end, we have two excerpts from two different papers, one thing that became my writing sample and one thing that was my writing sample, so the final paper that it started out as and the writing sample that it became. So we're going to go over those, talk about things that I did well, things that I didn't do so well, because there are plenty of those, and that's what we're going to do today. So let's get started. So I know Rick talked to you a bunch about applications yesterday, and he said a lot of stuff, and I think it was all really great. There are only a couple of things that I would add. I sort of had this as a way to like telescope into the writing sample, and I'm not going to talk about hardly any of this. Just a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. So one is that there are some unusual components that Rick didn't talk about because they're fairly uncommon. Like when I applied to 15 different places. I think one or two of them asked me for a second personal statement, in particular a statement about diversity. Now, that's pretty easy for you guys to write. I mean, you have a wealth of different experiences, but you also are a diverse site in a philosophy department by virtue of being female. So, you know, I think that statement is not something that carries a lot of weight in the admissions process anyways, but you know, you've got a head start on that. So that's something that's uncommon but that you may expect to see. I wound up sort of having chunks of my personal statement that I would sort of remix depending on the particular way that they phrase the writings, the personal statement. So like the part about my experience in a philosophy community became the diversity statement when it asked for a separate one. Otherwise, it was sort of mixed in with the rest of my personal statement.
Can I add something to that? The sort of thing Amy's talked about, in fact, at UCSD applications, there is a part where applicants are encouraged or invited to include something like a diversity statement. The purpose for that, at least at UCSD, other departments may differ, is that there are a number of fellowships and scholarships that are available to people if they've overcome certain hardships, including you know, things that might be related to diversity issues. So even though it's not, these things aren't directly relevant, or they don't have to be relevant to the admissions process, they are relevant to fellowships or scholarships that people might be eligible for if they are admitted. And so I'm guessing that at least in some of the cases of other institutions, that would be the same. And so go ahead and definitely fill them out, because you might be making yourself eligible for some additional financial support.
Cool. Yeah. So statement on diversity, and then a couple of other things. One is that if you have demonstrated financial need, you may in some cases be able to apply for a waiver for your application fee. That can be really important because some of them were $50, some of them were over $100, but if you apply to 15 schools and they're average out at about $75 to $80, that's a heck of a lot of money, and you may not be able to get a fee waiver, but if you have demonstrated need, you may be able to. So just keep that in mind. And then finally, I wanted to say, this takes so much time. So like for me, filling out the application form took a surprising amount of time because each school has slightly different stuff in a slightly different order, and it just takes a whole lot of time. So I want to emphasize this with writing samples in particular, but I also want to say, in addition to admissions fees, I spent so much money overnighting stuff via FedEx, like so much money. Please do not do that. It will save you a lot of pain if you get your stuff done ahead of time. In particular, your writing sample, because this, I think, takes the most time out of any of the components of your application. So, like Rick said yesterday, that everybody's got a different view of what's important in an application, and that's true. But when I asked the admissions committees, the people who've been on the admissions committee, what they thought was important, most of them said writing sample and letters of recommendation. Some of them said they didn't care about the writing sample at all, but most of them said those things. And you can't control your letters of recommendation. You're only going to spend a finite amount of time studying for the GRE, but your writing sample is something that you have a lot of control over. So it's the thing that I think you should expect to put the most work into and get the most benefit out for time spent. So that's why we're talking about it today. And so the process of getting a writing sample together, I've divided into 4 steps, and they might vary, but these are pretty basic steps. So we're going to talk about each of these. Picking a paper, probably a paper you already have, getting help figuring out where to go with it, then some tips about revising it, and then a reminder about how the end of the process is going to look, keeping revising it, some tips for how you might want to continue making revisions. But you're going to want to start early. So this takes a lot of time. I would suggest you should start in the summer or at the very latest in the early fall of the year that you want to apply, because you've got stuff going on. You have other classes, maybe you got a job. This stuff takes time, and you don't want to be rushing in the last couple weeks in November, and you've got it due maybe on December 1st. I'm going to really encourage you to work with other people, and that is enormously helpful, but it adds an extra component of time. So you email somebody, takes them a week to start reading it, then they read it slowly, they have to think about comments, they email them back to you, you have to put those comments in your document, maybe ask them some questions. That takes time, okay? If you're doing that in the last couple weeks of November, not going to look so good. So think about starting this as soon as you can. And then your goal is to wind up with a paper that's a paper that can convince somebody that you could be a grad student. So it's going to want to look like a grad school quality paper. Now, that doesn't mean that you could have sat down, in your dorm room with your computer and written that paper off the top of your head. Nobody's saying that. Nobody's expecting that when you get to UCSD or wherever, that you'll produce this quality of material right away and consistently through grad school. But what you want to be showing admissions committees is that this is the kind of thing that with time and training you're capable of doing. Okay? So that's what you're hoping to end up with when you start in on this process. Any questions so far? You guys can ask questions whenever, too, please. Same with online. Ask questions whenever. Okay, so starting out smaller than I realized. I'm sorry. So this is going to be text heavy, but you can see this presentation later, and we'll talk about all this stuff. So it'll be okay. I wanted to put a lot of text on these slides because I want you guys to be able to use this later too. So hopefully this can be a resource for you. Anyways, so the first thing that you're going to want to do is to pick a writing sample. And I'm just going to tell you right now, you should not expect to take a term paper or take a chapter from your thesis and mail it off and say, this got an A, cool, where's my funding? That's not going to work, because the standards for getting an A on an undergraduate paper, even if it's a good undergraduate paper, are not the same standards as they are for a graduate school writing sample. So what you want to do is look for something that you got an A on and you think you'd enjoy working on it until you're totally sick of it, and you have people who are going to help you work on it. That's the good start for a writing sample, but it's not something that you should expect to mail off right away. You should expect to spend a lot of time revising it. So the other option is to start something from scratch. And in general, I don't recommend that strategy, because if you're looking at something that you wrote as a thesis chapter or that you wrote for a class, you were guided on the right things to read for that, the questions that are worth asking and answering. If you start looking at something because you think it's just a really interesting topic, you could be right, but stuff that you just sort of go into head first you're likely to wind up with a paper that's overambitious. You say, you know, I started looking at this, I don't know, the problem of whatever, metaphysics and time, and it just seems obvious that the B theory of time is correct and the A theory sucks. And if you're looking at it that way, if you're saying this is the obvious true answer because you just started looking at something, it's going to be overambitious, it's going to be too broad, it's going to look like you're inexperienced. So in general, unless you have some kind of special circumstances, and we can talk about those in a minute, I think probably what you want to do is start with something that you already know is good and then make it better. So I don't know how many of you are in a position where you might be writing a senior thesis. Okay, good, good. So I wanted to talk about that just in case, and it looks like most of you will have that opportunity. Because this is a really important decision for you to make if you're thinking about using a thesis chapter as a writing sample. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. So if you start with a term paper, you have something that's already probably more or less writing sample length. You have something that's asking a specific question, answering it in a narrow way. It might be easy to expand into a writing sample length paper. On the other hand, maybe you wrote it while you were hungover on a Sunday and it's just not your best work. And a thesis is probably some of your best work, right? It's something that you've read a lot of the literature on, you know the debates, you're really interested in it because you wanted to spend a semester or a year thinking about it. That's a great place to look for a writing sample. But it's hard to take something that's 50 or 100 pages long and find the best 10 to 20 pages of it. Because you don't just want the best pages, you want something that will convince people that you can make a single coherent argument that asks a narrow question and answers it in a specific, detailed, elegant way. And it can be harder than you think to find something like that in 10 to 20 pages that you're picking out of a much larger area. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both of them, and it'll depend on your particular project that you have in your thesis, the term papers that you've written for classes. But you should be thinking about the advantages and disadvantages to doing it either way. Yeah, what's up?
So one of the other disadvantages of choosing a thesis chapter is that a lot of the times we finish them at the end of our senior year, where applications were due back in December.
Yeah. So it was so that's another issue with your thesis. So I don't know. At where I went to undergrad, we had an option to write a semester-long or year-long thesis, and so either of those is not really going to put you in a great position. So if you write a year-long thesis, Sherry's right, like you're going to have to get really fast to something that you think is writing sample length and writing sample quality, and you're going to have to be writing it while you're revising it while you're writing the rest of your thesis. And that's hard because you probably don't know the best 10 to 20 pages of your thesis until you've written the whole thing. On the other hand, if you do a one-semester thesis, first of all, you've got to finish it in the fall. You can't really write a spring thesis if you want to use it for applications. But also, if you write a one-semester thesis, you're really, really busy in that semester. And to be writing the thesis and figuring out the best part of it and revising that over and over again is a lot to bite. That's a big chunk to bite off in a single semester. So the timing of your thesis does matter. Of course, the same thing is true of seminar papers because those you probably won't be getting back until the fall semester of your senior year, the end, and then that's when your applications are due anyway. So that's a difficult question to figure out. I mean, if you have a great paper by the end of your junior year, that's really great, but you won't be able to use your senior year work unless you decide to take some time off between college and grad school. And I wouldn't recommend that just so that you have a really good writing sample, but it does mean that you will have the full scope of your college work done and you can look back at it by the time you are ready to send it off. On the other hand, unless you stay in your college town, you're going to be working with the faculty members you work with remotely. So, you're going to have to be working with them over phone and email, and that's not as easy as meeting with them face-to-face and talking about your project. In person. Track changes is just not as good as meeting with somebody. So, I'll just tell you what I did. I didn't apply to grad school until I was out of college and working. I had to make this decision between a thesis and a seminar paper. I chose my seminar paper because I thought it would be easier to make into a writing sample. I thought I would have had to do a lot more work to narrow it down, but also a lot more reading to figure out other stuff that I wanted to say in my writing sample. But I also picked the seminar paper because the person I wrote my thesis under was a wonderful person, but just horrible about responding to emails. I mean, just really, really bad. And I thought, there's no way that I will get enough guidance from this person that I could feel like getting my paper into good shape by the time I had to send it in. So that's another thing that you want to think about. What is the person that I'm working with, or the people, are they going to be available to me in the way that I need them to be available to me? And in my case, I didn't think that person would be. Thought the person who taught the class that I wrote the paper for would be more available. Turned out to be the case. And this is totally off topic, but I also feel like for me, taking time off between college and grad school was absolutely the right call. And I mean, if you ever want to talk about that, we totally can. I just, I think that there were a lot of advantages to that. So really off topic, but let me know if you're trying to figure out what you want to do after school, we can talk about it. So, and then the last question is, if you've got two things, if you've got two papers or a paper and a thesis, and one of them you wrote on, I don't know, something that you don't really care about, but it was really, really solid. You got an A, the professor said you should submit this to a conference, you should publish it in some kind of journal, but you don't really care, but you know that it's good, versus something that, like, you were just sort of testing the waters, and you didn't love the way the paper turned out, but you loved the area. Which of those do you pick? I mean, that's a really hard question. So, there are advantages to showing the committee who's reading your paper, like, this is what I want to do, and this is the kind of person you'd be getting who's interested in these questions. Rick talked about that some yesterday. On the other hand, there are also advantages to showing the committee, this is my very, very best work, and this is the caliber of person that you'd be getting. So that's a lot of that's going to depend on the circumstances you're in. How much better is the good paper? How much more passionate are you about the paper that you're really passionate about? But you should have help on figuring that out. So we're going to talk now about getting people together to help you. But before that, do you have any questions about starting out, picking a paper? Yeah.
What is, you said the length, 10 to 20 pages?
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a couple minutes, but I think basically around 12 to 20 pages, maybe a little less, probably not, a little bit more. But people have different thoughts on that. And this is another thing, like Rick said, everybody's got, like, all the admissions committees have different feelings, and you'll see that there's a big diversity in, like, kinds of feedback that I got from admissions committees, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so you've got something that you think might be a good writing sample. The next step, and these two are going to really kind of go together, is to find a group of people who can help you with it. So I just really want to emphasize this. You should not be doing this alone. You're not in a position yet, even if you're very, very talented, to be able to spot all the pitfalls philosophically in your paper, to know what makes a paper look good and polished and like a grad school or higher level paper. You just don't have the experience yet. But there are people around you who do. And so first off, I suggest that you pick somebody who will be the main person that you work on your paper with. And this is probably the person that you wrote the paper for, but it might not be. I mean, depending on how many people there are in your department who know the area that you want to write the paper on or that you want to revise the paper on, depending on the personal strengths and weaknesses and how well you work with the person. But you probably want to start off by going to the person you wrote the paper for and saying, look, I got an A on this paper. I'd like to apply to grad school. You like me, maybe we've been talking about grad school, you're supporting me. Do you think, honestly, that this is a good paper? And hopefully the person will be honest and say, yeah, this is, or no, but you wrote this other paper, or no, but blah, blah, blah really likes you. Why don't you talk to them about whether the paper you wrote for their class will work? That you want the person to be honest with you don't want to spend all your time revising a paper that sucks, you know? So start with one person and see what they think, and hope and try to find somebody who will like shepherd you primarily through the process. But after that, and one other option is to do an independent study with this person. So say, look, you know, in the fall, can we, you know, I've got this time on my schedule, can we do an independent study where we read more literature on this topic, where I bring you a new version every couple weeks, we talk about how it could be improved. If you want to write a paper from scratch, this might be the best or only way to do it, to say, look, I really like philosophy of religion, but I just took the one intro class. Can we do an independent study where I write a paper on philosophy of religion for my writing sample? I still don't think that writing something from scratch is the best way to go, but if you really want to, that might be a good way to do it. So you got one faculty member. Then try to get others on board. You've got more than one person writing you letters. Okay, those people in theory are people who like you and support you and think you should go to grad school. Hopefully they're willing to put their money where their mouth is and help you, you know, even just once or twice. If you have two other people reading your writing sample once each, that's a lot more eyes to spot potential pitfalls that your main person might not. Everybody sees different things in a philosophy paper, and you know, having other faculty look at it is a really good idea. So if you get more faculty on board, then other places you can look. If your university has grad students, make friends with them, ask them to read your paper. You know, they'll see other things too. They might be able to spend more time on it, they might not, depending on their schedules. If you have other friends who are applying to grad school, make a writing group. This is also really good advice, so make a note of it. You should totally have a writing group where you write with people and exchange drafts and talk about things. But if you know other undergrads who are doing this, do it together. They'll see things too. And then finally, I worked for a writing center when I was in college, so I just want to put in a plug for them. Philosophers, some of them are great writers, some of them are terrible writers. And you want your writing sample to not just be good philosophy, but a piece of writing that people can read easily and understand and enjoy reading. A really good way to have a paper that's clear and flows and doesn't have major grammatical errors is to take it to a writing center. They're not going to tell you, you know, no, David Lewis never said that, but they will tell you this comma is in the wrong place. And that can be a really important thing because people care about that. Okay, any questions about that? Yeah.
About how many people would you suggest getting to read your writing sample?
Honestly, as many as possible, because you have to keep in mind, so like, you really want the person who's the main person to be somebody you can depend on. But otherwise, people will flake, you know? Somebody will say, okay, I'm going to do this, and then the class they're teaching takes up more time. I had an advisor whose mom got really sick when he was like trying to work on my writing sample, and he just couldn't do it. Really, honestly, as many people as will read your writing sample, honestly, if your mom is, you know, interested in it, and like has a good eye for this stuff, have your mom read your writing sample. Have your cat read your writing sample. I don't get as many like beings to read it as possible. Yeah.
Maybe this will come up later, but how often can you actually send this to your professor? Let's say your writing sample is 30 pages long.
Mm-hmm.
How many times can you send them a 30-page paper?
Yeah. I think that really, really depends. So it depends on your relationship with the person. I think I sent my advisor and I think went through at least 5 or 6 rounds of the writing sample, and other people, I probably had a couple people who read it once and maybe 1 or 2 people who read it maybe 3 or 4 times. But, you know, I think my advisor, I was really close with my advisor, and I know he really wanted me to go to grad school, so I think he would have read it a million times if he had to, maybe. But other people have different commitments, and, you know, I think if somebody's, what you want is somebody who will be honest with you about how much time he or she can put into it. Of course, what you don't want is somebody who says, I can read it every week, and then can't, because commitments come up, and there may not be a way to know going in. But I think potentially somebody who's really committed to this, you could ask them to read it many times. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there ever a kind of situation where, like, if you say you're taking your paper to professors,
there's a disagreement in like paper topic or paper development or something, because I know I have a couple of professors in the philosophy department who have very strong like disagreements in subjects, topics, just general writing styles. Kind of how would you like suggest resolving that if you're working with like multiple people in this disagreement with your paper?
So for me personally, I would pick the person whose advice I trusted the most and listen to them more. But that will depend a lot on the particular situation. I don't know if anybody else has ideas for how to handle that. But I mean, you will, like Rick said, and like we'll talk about more, philosophers just disagree a lot on even mechanical stuff like how a paper should look. And it's not clear, you know, how to pick who's right. And of course, the admissions committee will be in the same boat because they will have disagreements about what a good writing sample is like. And so maybe this is practice for like how your paper will be viewed. I don't know. But yeah, if you have if you don't have a really clear idea about who's obviously better, then I would just go with the person that you trust more. I don't know. Any other questions? Okay, so you have a paper and you have some people working on it. So now you're going to make your first revision. So when you're starting out, just some things to think about, some goals. Oh, I'm really sorry, this is too small, you guys. So you're aiming for 12 to 20 pages. And people disagree about this. So some people will say, sure, send me a 50-page paper and just put a post-it note on the front that says, read mostly pages 15 through 30. Or like, you know, send me a 15-page paper and give me an index, an appendix, and I'll just read the 15-page paper and maybe I'll read the appendix. I don't recommend that because, well, some people are cool with that, other people are not. And they might be irritated by it, or they might, you know, they might not even intend to, but they might read your paper less charitably because they think this person didn't follow the rules and that looks bad. So I would say 20 pages is a hard cap. I think people disagree, but I would say that. And I would say there's no shame in making your paper be shorter. You know, 15 to 18 pages is a great length for a writing sample. Shorter than 12 you might be able to do, but you below about 10, and I think you really start getting into tricky territory, were you able to ask a question that's interesting enough to catch an admissions committee's eye, and were you able to answer it in a detailed way that, you know, really appreciates objections and answers them in a detailed way too. I think that's unlikely to happen under 10 pages, but maybe, but probably not. So I would suggest about 12 to 20 pages. When you're starting out, I think, look, you probably, if you were writing this for a class, you probably read 2 to 4 papers about it. And you probably read them, maybe not with the greatest care. I would say start out by rereading those papers with a more charitable eye, looking more closely at the details of their accounts, you know, maybe looking more into things that you glossed over when you were reading them initially. And then I'd say, look, read related literature. And this is tricky because you only have so much time. So this is where a faculty member is a real help. Say, look, we read, I don't know, Mealy and Mosier in the action theory class, but what else has Mealy written on action? You know, what else should I read? And they'll know, and then you won't have to go to the library and check out all the books on action theory and try to figure out what from that giant stack is relevant to your writing sample. Okay, so read related literature, but do pay attention to your timeline. And then one of the big tasks for your writing sample, especially if you wrote it as like a paper for a class, when you got the topic, you know, it said, blah says this about moral responsibility, and blah says that. Who's better and why, right? So in your answer, you started off assuming that the person reading it knew something about the topic, knew why the thing was interesting, had some of the basics of Blah's account down, and you could go from there. So one of the key things about turning an essay prompt into a real paper is to figure out what else you need to make it look like a real paper. And one of those things is going to be, look, show the motivation for the problem. Why, besides I had to write this paper, is this question interesting and important? Okay? So you're going to need to be thinking about what about the question makes it interesting independently of, I don't know, it's being a prompt or maybe related areas that you happen to read in your action theory class. Okay. So, let's see, what else did I? Yeah. So I mean, you want to make it seem like you care, and you want the people reading the paper to know why the topic is interesting. Okay. Then I'd suggest making an outline. So you maybe already wrote an outline when you're writing the paper the first time, but you're going to be making significant changes to the paper. You might be adding whole sections, deleting whole sections, rearranging things to make the order more logical or more interesting. An outline can really help with that, even though you already know a lot of the stuff that you want to say. So I would definitely suggest thinking about this kind of pre-writing stuff that you've done already for the paper. Do it again. Okay? And that's going to help you with your next job, which is to expand the paper. So if you wrote a 10-page seminar paper, you've got 2 to 10 more pages worth of material. That's a lot of stuff. The paper that I wrote that you guys are going to be reading an excerpt from in a few minutes, that was originally 22 pages, but I deleted a ton of stuff from it and then added stuff in. So, you know, the final paper that I wound up with was 18 pages, but there's a lot of new material in there. So what you need to do in making this look like a grad school paper is to deepen the analysis. And so here are several ways to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of whatever topic. So the first one is to decompress. So this is a problem that I had all the time in undergrad and still have now. My papers are pretty compressed. I sort of, you know, take things for granted. I skip over steps in an argument, especially ones that I'm kind of uncomfortable with. I don't really know how to prove this, so I'm just sort of going to take it for granted, and then I'm going to move on to the step that I really want to talk about. It's not going to work, right? That's not a good paper. It shows that you're uncomfortable with the topic. So you really want to go over the paper you have with a fine-tooth comb. Think about the assumptions that you brought to the table. Think about the things that you just sort of hand-waved at and maybe you can talk about in more depth now. Think about the objections that you were uncharitable towards and how you can really beef those up so that you can seem more impressive when you tear them down in a couple pages. Think about explanations that you can expand. Think about ways that you can connect it more broadly and deeply to the literature. So if your paper is a history paper, how can you read the passage more closely? You know, what obscure terms can you get into in more depth? If you are, I mean, for really any paper, consider more sources. Think about more different contrasting views. A really good way for a paper to seem like you wrote it for a class is if you only cite 1 or 2 things and you only cite 1 or 2 passages. That's a really good signal that I read the things that were assigned and then I stopped. And you don't want it to seem like that. You want to seem like you're capable of doing research and coming up with interesting things to say about a wide variety of things, although of course you also want the paper to be deep and penetrating and have real analysis and stuff too. But you don't just want it to look like you read one thing and you called it a day. Another way to deepen this is to think about more objections. So maybe, you know, you had, I don't know, you had Rawls, and then you had 1 cent objection to Rawls, and then you said, okay, but Rawls is the best. And while that's true, you want to think about other stuff in this paper. You want to say, okay, Sen has this objection, Mills has this objection. How are they different? How are they similar? How does Rawls get around them? You can have more objections in a longer paper, and you can be more charitable to them. Initially, Sen seems totally implausible. Then we think about it, and we realize it's much more plausible, and yet Rawls is so totally clearly right, or whatever. That's just an example. Nobody, I mean, that's whatever. So, and then I guess the last thing to say, like, look, you've got a 10-page paper. You're turning it into something that's closer to 20 pages. Should you add a whole new argument? I think that really depends, but I would say you should approach that with caution. So for one thing, that's a whole lot more work, right? It's a lot more work to figure out a new argument to get to the same conclusion. But it also, I think, if you can produce a paper that has a single argument that's totally clear and totally lucid and totally penetrating, and you've overcome all the objections, that's better than spending some time on one argument and then maybe sort of going over another one and maybe coming back to the first one. But I mean, I would say, look, concentrate on the argument that you've got first. And if you're spinning your wheels, or you really think, I really can't talk about this without talking about this other thing, that's when you start developing a new argument, but not before then. And related to that, I think, look, don't try to do too much. If you're saying, look, in this grad school writing sample, I will prove conclusively that God exists. No, don't do that, please. It's not going to work. It's going to look like you're, you know, somebody who came at this, you know, reading one bad argument against God and then saying, okay, this argument sucks. God totally exists, and I'm going to prove it in my writing sample. That's not a good way to go. What you want to think about is, here's a really interesting problem for a particular view. I'm going to make progress on that problem. Not I'm going to prove or disprove that utilitarianism is true. And then this is really small, and I'm sorry, Sherry, you're totally right. I changed it, but there's still too much text on these slides. But here's some more general writing tips. So really, really, really important. You guys probably don't do this, but please do not begin your paper, since the dawn of time, man has wondered whether categories exist. Do not do that. Oh my God, it is the #1 way for you to seem like you just turned in a paper that you wrote for a seminar and probably didn't get a very good grade on. Really, really do not do that. I hate it so much. But also just, I mean, since the dawn of time one is stupid and you would never do that. But also be careful about your topic sentences in general. So you don't want it to seem like you're trying to make your paper seem important by puffing it up. The #1 problem for consequentialism is, that's a really bad way to start, because there is no single #1 problem, and that's going to grind somebody's gears, even though that's not since the dawn of time. You know, you don't want to begin with a sentence that's too general. When I write, I don't start with an introductory sentence at all. I sort of just start writing, and often I find that the sentence that I started with is a pretty good starting sentence anyways, because you just want to dive right into the paper, especially in a graduate school writing sample, because the people on the committee will probably read the introduction most carefully. So you really want the introduction to get there right away and stay interesting. So starting with a sentence that bloviates is really, really not a good strategy for a writing sample. And then don't use jargon. So you want to minimize technical terms, you want to explain them, but you also want to keep in mind that the meanings for the terms that you used in class might not be the meanings that everybody accepts. So like when I was teaching intro ethics in the spring, when we talked about deontology, I basically defined it as Kantian deontology. Totally acceptable for an undergrad intro ethics class, I think. Not acceptable if you're writing a paper on normative ethics and you're focusing on deontology, right? So this is a place where a faculty member is going to be really helpful. We talked about the causal theory of action in class. Is this the definition that everybody accepts for the causal theory of action? If not, what are the alternatives? How do I define this in a way that isn't really going to grind somebody's gears? Okay. Choose your quotations really carefully. So you don't want to rely on quotations too much. You don't want your paper to be like a necklace where you have quotation, a little bit of analysis, big quotation, more analysis. It's a really good way to make it seem like you didn't do that much work. You don't really have an interesting thing to say about what you're talking about. So you want to minimize your quotations, but you also want to explain them every time you use them. You want to say, look, when I say that David Lewis said this, he said that, and I can tell you why, because this means this and that means that, and I know what I'm talking about. You don't want to use a long quotation in general, but you definitely don't want to leave a long quotation unexplained. And then as far as your voice, you write for a reader who's lazy, stupid, mean, and unsophisticated. So two of these things are true, right? Your admissions committee is lazy because they're going through so many papers. Okay, they're probably not stupid or unsophisticated, but they may not know the area that you're writing about really well, right? If you're writing on metaphysics and you've got a historian, an ethicist, and a philosopher of religion, tough luck. You know, you better explain your metaphysics jargon. And they may be mean if they're reading a paper, you know, late at night after a, you know, cup of, I don't know, beer or whatever, cup of beer. You want your paper to be charitable, you want it to be clear, you want it to be totally easy to understand, because somebody who's read 50 papers today is not going to want to take the time to parse a difficult sentence in yours. Okay? You also, somebody who's mean is going to pick up on fake sophistication right away. So don't try to sound sophisticated in an area that you're not. Don't bring in extra philosophy. Don't throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. So when I first learned about possible worlds, I used them in every single paper I wrote. In a possible world, if this has more utils, then blah, blah, blah. Sounds really dumb to somebody who knows the technical uses of possible worlds for me to be bringing in this random piece of jargon, right? You don't want to do that. I had a friend who's writing a sample I was reading. It was about contextualism and epistemology, and all of a sudden he was talking about moral relativism and the Holocaust. It was a really bad mistake, because you don't want to try to connect everything to your topic, because that, you know, that's fake sophistication and it doesn't look good. Then some things about making your structure super clear. Basically, these are all just structure. This section is make everything really clear. So again, committee members are not reading every sentence of your writing sample carefully, but many of them said, and we'll talk about this later, that they pay special attention to the introduction. So you want to make your thesis extremely clear early on for people who aren't reading it carefully the first time around. You want to make your structure obvious. So a lot of them said something like, I read the introduction, I read the conclusion, and I pick out a page or two in the body of the paper, and I read that carefully. Don't read the whole thing, but I read selections. And if somebody's going to page 7 of your writing sample, you want them to know where they are in the argument without having to hunt around. So you want connecting words. You want to say, in the previous section I argued blah, however, here I will argue blah. First this, second this. Before this follows from that. You want all of those things. You want a signpost. In the last section, I said this. This section, I will show this, and this leads to my conclusion that this. You really want the structure to be obvious. And I think headings help here. So if your paper was 10 pages, maybe you didn't have subheadings. But in a paper that's longer than that, you probably want headings, because then somebody can say, here's a discrete section where they're answering a specific part of this question. I can just read this section, and then I've got a good idea of what they're saying in the paper. Heading helped there. When I was picking out stuff for us to read in a little bit, I was able to pick stuff just from looking at a subject heading. And then be clear in your conclusion about what you've answered and what you haven't. Your conclusion and your introduction should match. And by that I mean that when you say in your introduction, I will argue this, this, and this, in your conclusion you should be able to show that you argued this, this, and this, and not this. And one pitfall of starting a paper with an introduction, writing-wise, and finishing it with a conclusion is that often they won't match. You'll start out in your introduction thinking, I'm going to talk about this, then you go off on a rabbit trail, something else gets interesting, part of the argument gets bigger, part gets smaller, and the conclusion and the introduction don't match. So you really want somebody who's reading only those two things and a little bit in the middle to be able to follow everything. Then just a couple philosophical mistakes. You don't want to make a category mistake like utilitarianism believes that. Okay? Theories don't have beliefs. So that's something that if I were grading an undergraduate paper, even a paper that got an A, I would let that slide. I get what they're saying, but you don't want to think that somebody's going to let a category mistake like that slide, because you get the person who really hates it when you attribute beliefs to theories, and that person is going to think, yeah, you weren't careful. You weren't writing this carefully. So you want to watch out for even small mistakes like that. That's where having, like, one of your advisors isn't going to notice that and another one is, and that's why you want to have 1 million people read it. Same thing with assumptions, you know, like, so you don't want to flag every single assumption. You don't want to say, in this paper on consequentializing value, I'm going to assume that we're all not brains and vats. That sounds stupid. But you do want to flag assumptions that are relevant to the topic at hand. Okay? Otherwise, it looks like you were flying past stuff. Okay, and then the last thing to do is to revise more. So you did this, it was a ton of work, and now you do it all over again. So you revise many, many, many times. You send drafts to everybody you can think of. Really, honestly, your mom, if you think it would help and not freak you out more, or make her be freaked out by the career path you've chosen. Everybody who will read your draft, send it to them. And really, honestly, seriously do read papers out loud. I am not good at doing this because I feel like a dope reading a paper to myself in my apartment, but I always read my presentations out loud because I'm going to be saying them out loud. And it is astonishing to me every single time how many things I find that could be clearer when I'm reading something out loud to myself. It also, I think, helps me make things sound more natural. So, does this sound like something a real person would say? If it doesn't, there must be a better way to phrase it. Okay? And talking your paper out narratively can help with that too. So, you know, talk to somebody who's smart but not a major. Say, you know, philosophers think this about addiction, but I don't think that's right, and does this make sense to you why somebody would think that? That can really help you get clear on what you want to say and how you can say it more clearly. Same thing with constructing an outline at the end of the process. So I've got my thesis statement, I've got the topic sentences from the paragraphs where I start talking about new things. Here's an outline of those. Does this make sense? Does it look like an argument? Does it hang together? That can help you see if your organization's all right or if you need to move stuff around. Okay. And then I think multiple times, but at the end of your paper, go through the whole thing sentence by sentence. Do I need this sentence? Do I need this word? Could I find a simpler synonym for this word that would make it clearer? Okay. Which of these things can you cut out? Will it make your paper clearer? Will it make it more concise? If you're struggling to fit into 20 pages, you know, will it help you add things that you really need in the paper? I really think you want to look at, you want to read a sentence at a time, you want to read it out loud, you want to see if it works. And then when should you expect to be done? I mean, honestly, I didn't finish revising my writing sample by the time my first ones were due. And you don't want to be in that position. Because for sure, UCSD was one of the schools with the latest deadlines, and I don't think it's an accident that I got in here and not to some of the schools that I applied to earlier, because my writing sample was better by the end. So, you know, you may want to keep doing it as you're applying to grad school, which sucks because you just want it to be over. But, you know, especially if you didn't get a head start, you may want to consider revising your paper through the admissions process. Okay. Any questions so far on the process of doing this? Yeah.
Okay, this might be a stupid question, but when you say 12 to 20 pages, is that single spaced or double spaced?
No, that's a really good question. Double spaced.
Okay.
Yeah. So double spaced. I forget if my endnotes counted or references. I think probably what you want to assume is that people will read about 12 to 20 pages. So maybe if you have a lot of references, it doesn't matter if they're on page 21. But you know, I think you're safer the shorter it is, honestly. But yeah, double spaced. Yeah.
A lot of the programs that I'm looking at say 30 pages. Yeah, so do you think that it is that they want a maximum of 30 pages and I should really think about somewhere around 20 pages? Or have you ever heard of people sending in actual 30?
I'm sure people, I know people have sent in 30 pages, and probably to programs that say up to 30 pages, that's not a problem. But, I mean, Rick was nodding his head when you said, is it a hard cap? And I think that's true. I also think unless every program that you're sending it to says up to 30 pages, you probably don't want to be writing two drafts, one that's 20 pages and one that's 30 pages, because you'll go insane. You'll totally forget where you are in both of those papers. So you want to be aiming for the shorter paper And that might be an unexpected gift to admissions committees that let you have up to 30 pages, but you definitely don't want to be sending a 30-page paper to an admissions committee that says up to 20 pages.
I meant mostly like if they say 30 pages, can I send 20 pages?
Yeah, yeah. That's what I would do. Yeah. Yeah.
I know that you said, you know, not to be too ambitious or anything, but like one thing that's always sort of on my mind when I'm thinking about a topic or choosing an essay is like to go more for something that maybe will not catch them by surprise, but sort of something like that will grab them, something that's not as predictable, like a more novel idea, maybe something that isn't so obvious and so mainstream. And like, I was just like wondering what your take on that was. Like, do you think that they would rather sort of read through an essay of something that they can predict beginning to end, or would it be more? I mean, most of the stuff that you've been saying is like, you know, make it like simple, make it like very easy to read, and that sort of goes along with it, right? Like the topic as well, or would you say that novel is good?
I would say you want originality, but not necessarily novelty. So you want something where, like, it's clear that you didn't just read two people and sort of side with one because you liked it better because the arguments were better. You want something where you're saying, okay, this is the contribution that I'm making to this particular argument. But sometimes novelty can be like, you know, I'm not really citing anyone in particular. I think this is interesting and I've developed some views on it, but I don't really have a good grounding in the literature. I just think this is really interesting. And I think that would ring some warning bells for people, because if you haven't read stuff by people who have thought about this for many years, it's more likely, not necessarily true, but more likely that you'll make some elementary mistakes that you could avoid if you were better versed in the literature. But I think if you've got something that you really care about and you think, oh, this is really cool, and I thought about this and it seems novel to me, you might be right. And the best way to know whether something is novel and awesome or novel and sounds like something that a crank wrote in his mom's basement is to run it by somebody who knows more about philosophy than you do. And they can tell you, yeah, this is really, really cool, and this will catch an admissions committee's eye in a good way.
And like about the jargon that you were talking about, like avoiding, you know, to use too much jargon. If I'm writing a paper about something specific, is it more likely that, you know, if I'm writing about philosophy of science, for example, that the committee will sort of hand over my paper to someone who's more familiar with that subject? So I should, or maybe that question is more for you.
Yes.
Okay.
It's not uncommon for admissions committees to farm out a paper if no one on the admissions committee is like really specializes in that topic. Yeah, we do that. I mean, it probably happens. There's 10 or so of those that we'll do maybe on average.
Yeah.
Okay, this might be a really dumb question, but at my school at least, like professors don't tell me like what citation style I should use. So what is like the preferred citation style?
God, is there one? I don't remember that I paid any attention to that when I was applying to grad school. I mean, I think you want citations and you want them to be in a consistent style, but philosophy I think has the strength and weakness, whatever you want to call it, of not having a particular preferred citation style. So whatever is easiest for you.
So there's not like endnotes or better than footnotes?
I mean, I think footnotes are better just in general, but of course the downside to them is that if you're really, really pressed for space, they do take up space, and maybe somebody looks at that differently, but hopefully you won't be in the situation where you're so pressed to hit 20 pages that you need to have your endnotes on a separate page. Otherwise, I think footnotes are clearly better. Yeah.
This might be a more general question, but are there topics to avoid in papers, or just like topics that committees have seen just like so many times that it's not worth it to do it again, or is that just not a consideration? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. Rick is probably in a better place. Like, I don't know, are there things that you got tired of reading when you've been in admissions committees?
Oh yeah, but not to the point where I would categorize it as advice for people not to write on those. So there are topics that people write on pretty consistently, but that's not bad. I mean, typically are doing that because they are central topics in philosophy. As long as it's not wacky, like Amy was saying, then it's fine.
Out of curiosity, what are a couple of those?
Yeah. The wacky ones? Or
The most common.
Well, basically, if you go to any sub area of philosophy, like philosophy of mind or whatever, and you just ask yourself, what's the biggest question here, and maybe even sort of the easiest to grasp question, that'll show up a lot. So in philosophy of mind, you get papers on the hard problem of consciousness, loads of those. It kind of drives me nuts after a while reading so many of those, especially since I'm a philosophy of mind guy. I end up getting stuck with them. But I don't hold it against people. It's a common topic. It's what gets taught in philosophy of mind courses and consciousness courses. That's what one of the big topics they're gonna see. So it's not bad. And there's parallel things in ethics and philosophy of science, history of philosophy.
Okay, so like I said before, I asked a bunch of people who've been on previous admissions committees what they had to say. So I've just got a few slides of things that they've said. So just to say this again, work with people to get a lot of feedback. This person said their supervisor and perhaps teaching assistants or other friendly graduate students. I'd say whoever you can get, you think would give you good comments. And somebody else said, look, if 2 good up-to-date philosophy professors at your school think your sample's excellent, admissions committees probably will think so too. Of course, the trick there is finding people you know to be good and up-to-date. That may be hard at your school. It may just be hard to know who those people are, but I hope you can find some people who are like that. Then what should you write about? So make a serious attempt at originality, but also be appropriately respectful of other work in the area. So like we've talked about, think about the literature, treat it carefully and charitably and seriously, but don't just say, this person said this and this person said that. Say something new in your paper. It's better usually for applicants to choose topics that are related to what they're thinking about possibly studying. So Rick talked about that a little bit yesterday, I know. And this person went on to say, of course, if they've got something really good in an area that isn't what they're studying, or their home department doesn't have philosophy of physics, but they want to do philosophy of physics, we're not going to hold that against them. But it would be odd if you took 15 courses on global justice and said, I want to work on global justice, and your writing sample paper was something about metaphysics. That would seem like you didn't have something strong in the area that you want to work on. That's a red flag. Were there references in the writing sample to the work of the people that this statement's on? So this actually happens in job talks sometimes. Somebody will come here for a job talk and give a paper on something that somebody in the department works on and not cite that person. And it's kind of insulting or like weird or like, did you know that this person works on this thing? That's not as bad maybe for a writing sample, but if you say, look, I want to come work with Jonathan Cohen on philosophy of color, and you write a paper on philosophy of color and you don't cite Jonathan Cohen who's here, it looks bad. You want your writing sample to reflect the literature, especially literature at the school you're applying to. And then, is there a clear problem and solution? Do you formulate a problem and present and assess alternative solutions? And you'll have more room to do multiple alternative solutions in a slightly longer paper. So what should your writing be like? I mean, all of these things are good. Focused, clear, precise, analytically rigorous, easy to read and follow, and well organized. These are the things that you get over multiple drafts. Clear, concision, commitment to philosophy, and then you get conflicting advice here. So make sure the essays aren't too long, says one person. Another person says, I think it's okay to send something too long, acknowledging that it's over the requested length, with advice about what to read. I do not recommend this strategy. People don't like it if you don't follow the rules. Some people think it's okay, but other people say make sure they're not too long. So you do get conflicting advice from admissions committees. In this case, I think the answer is pretty clear, but people disagree. It shouldn't contain any grammatical errors or typos. Really easy to say, really hard to actually do. This is where multiple eyes and a writing center can really help. And then use precision, and this is again something that comes with repeated drafts. So how do I read it? So again, people read first and last paragraphs and then something in the middle. generally, but not always. So while you really want your introduction to be strong and you really want your conclusion to be strong, you also really want everything else to be strong, because you don't know the middle part that somebody's going to read. Or maybe the person that you have reading it isn't somebody who carefully reads the beginning. They just go right into the middle because that's where the meat is. You have to make everything strong. There's not really a magic bullet to you know, getting it easier by, you know, only writing part of it really carefully. But then this other person said, look, I don't pay that much attention to writing samples. I pay more attention to other stuff. So, you know, as Rick said, people approach this differently. Somebody asked whether you could submit more than one writing sample, and I think in general this is probably something that is atypical unless you have, I don't know, really diverse interests that you really want to highlight. But somebody responded that 2 writing samples can lead to split decisions. You know, the person who does philosophy of religion loves your philosophy of religion paper. The person who does ethics hates your ethics paper. They can't agree. Maybe they agree not to admit you. Okay, you're better off focusing your efforts on one thing. Okay, if you do 2, you're spending time on 2 things, and that's going to be harder to produce 2 really high quality things. And then while you want to be immersed in the literature, if you mostly studied English and you decided at the last second that you want to do philosophy and you got great grades and you got great letters, but you just didn't have the time to read everything in global justice, people will make allowances for that if you can build a good case, things like your personal statement, for why you don't have a ton of familiarity with the literature. Okay. We're running low on time, so I'm going to just zip through some resources really quickly. So one thing to know is how you write, and Rick talked about this a lot yesterday, I know. This is hard to do if you have a constrained schedule because you've got a job or you've got you know, other things on your time, you know, other classes or whatever. But if you know that you need, you know, to work on Saturday because you can work all day, that's great. I use something called the Pomodoro technique. I don't know if anybody has heard of that. I am a terrible procrastinator, and I need to like have breaks. And so in this technique, you write or do whatever for 25 minutes, and then you get a 5-minute break, and then you write for 25 minutes, and then you get a 5-minute break, and then you do that 4 times, and then you take like a longer break, like 15 to half an hour. That really helps me because 25 minutes is not so long that a break isn't just around the corner, but 5 minutes isn't a super long break, and then I can get back into it. So I like that. I also, style is my favorite style guide. If you want a book to tell you about how to make your prose clear and lucid and have a good voice and have flow, that's my favorite one. I'll say it again, Writing Center. And then you can all access this PDF. Again, you can go to my website, which is in the links for the YouTube and the Google Hangout sites. And there are links to all of these resources, some of which I used in making this presentation. Generally about philosophy papers, generally about applying to graduate school. The ones about applying to grad school have sections about writing samples that can be helpful. David's, who's at UCSD, is shorter. Eric Schwitzgabel's is really, really long and detailed. So these are both really good resources for thinking about applying to grad school. Yeah.
Question.
Oh, yeah.
From Nicole Ross. She says, hi, I've started looking at page requirements for writing samples at some of the schools I'm looking at, and not all of them overlap. For example, fewer than 15 pages at one school, 15 to 25 at another. How would you recommend handling that?
Gosh, that sucks. I'm sorry that that's happened to you. I didn't have to deal with that. I would recommend trying to find something in your 15-page paper that you can cut easily. So if you've got something that's just below 15 and something that's like 15 to 20 or whatever, I would recommend, I guess the thing that I would do is to see whether there's a way that you can shorten the things that aren't absolutely essential, which for me first would be your introduction and conclusion. See if you can cut those down in a way that gets you to 14.9 pages or whatever. I would try to do that. If you have some kind of piece of your paper that's something that you can hive off more easily, an argument that isn't totally central, I guess that's where I'd go next. Good luck. I don't know. That's tough.
Yeah, if I could add something to that. Don't quote me if you end up applying and not getting into grad schools on the basis of this, but quite often the text on these things, you go to a website, it's giving you the instructions on how to apply. That text is written by some person who someone said, hey, can you write text for this, tell people how to apply? And there's a good chance they ballparked that number, right? If they say 15 to 25 pages, they didn't have a departmental meeting with a committee and then they sort of all voted on whether it should be 14 or 15, and someone came up with it. My guess is that it's extremely unlikely if a place says 15 to 25 pages and you've got a 13-page writing sample, they're really going to sort of throw your application out. A lot of people on the admissions committee may not realize that their instructions said 15 to 25. Seriously, I have no idea what our instructions say, and I'm the director of graduate studies. I've been on the last 4 search committees. I don't know what they say. So if there's, I think Amy's advice of 12 to 20 is really solid. I think that's very good length, and I would be really surprised if any admissions committees, got irritated by anything that was in that interval.
I have some slides up that I'm going to skip through, and maybe we can get to them if we have more time, about various writing software programs that can be helpful for people. But since we're already at 10 after 8, I'm going to skip to the next thing, which is for you guys to look at a writing sample, which is mine, and we'll talk about it. So if you go to the link that Rick provided, if you're looking at this online, you can find these. So we're going to start with the paper that's called Final Seminar Paper. So I'm going to give you guys 5 to 10 minutes to read that over and just think about what's good in it, what's bad, what you might cut, what looks like it could be improved. So go ahead and do that. I won't be insulted, by the way. I found 50 things that I would absolutely change in a heartbeat if I did this again. So nothing you say, I hope, can hurt me.
Is it accidental that you've got UCSD's colors there?
It's sort of more of a pea green.
Oh, really?
Yeah, projected. But that would have been really great until it did that. Okay, finish up if you haven't already. We'll start maybe in about a minute or two. Okay, so thoughts. Tell me things that I did well or things that I could have done better. Yeah.
This is just a difference between the writing sample and the final seminar paper. When I read the introduction of your final seminar paper, you say you're less specific about what it is you're going to do. So you like lay out the views and you say that you're going to challenge one, but you say, oh, I'm going to conclude by attempting to solve these problems, but you didn't really give a direction of how you're going to solve them.
Good.
That's very clear in the writing sample. Well, yeah, you say that they're more complex than some relationists believe, and you give more of an indication where you're going. Isn't that?
Thanks. Let's focus on the seminar paper for now, and then we can talk about the writing sample after that. So if you didn't read both of them, that's fine. But yeah, so I think that's absolutely right. I do think that the introduction is one of the weaker points of the seminar paper. It goes on for a while, and I don't say what my thesis actually is, and I think that was a big mistake. Yeah. Other thoughts on the seminar paper? Yeah.
There's a lot of quotes, and most of them are not explained in particular depth, and they're all from the original source rather than secondary critical sources.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, and I mean, of course, that's how a lot of seminar papers are. I mean, you will see a difference in how many quotations there are between the two papers, but of course, like if you look really carefully, you notice there's also a difference in the number of sources, because I was reading 2 sources for the seminar paper, but there are a lot of quotations in the seminar paper. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I thought that the structure was strange, and I had to kind of flip back because I was trying to remember. It seemed like this paper, the final seminar paper, started off with the person that you were going to be agreeing with, and you almost immediately contrasted them with with someone that you disagreed with. When it seemed like in your structure, like you were going to show the problems with the first two, and then get into the other parts later. So I would just say that like the overall structure was really confusing.
Yeah, no, maybe, so I didn't explain this. I'm sorry, I left this unsaid. So these are not contiguous parts of the paper. So the body paragraphs are from the middle of the paper. But, you know, that may still be the case in the organization of the overall paper. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah.
This might just be a difference in the way I do things, but I find that most of the real meat of the paper, like the analysis part, is like towards the very end, and I kind of wish that it was more like embedded into like the other parts of the paragraphs, especially after the quotes. And then like the very last few sentences are what I feel like you should have sort of maybe started with, or like maybe.
Excellent. So there are a lot of things there that I think connect with some stuff that Macy said. So one thing to do is to move what I will say up to the beginning of the paragraph, at least as a topic sentence, if not right away to say my whole view. But then also, if I were explaining my quotations in more detail, I'd be bringing more analysis in and integrating it instead of having it in the back of the paragraph, you know, hanging out all by itself all at once in maybe sort of a disorganized way. So I think that's a really good set of points. Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
I had a couple professors who had different views on. So I know that philosophy papers often use pronouns, and like makes it clear to sort of say what you're going to do. And then I've had professors that preferred me to do that, and then I had other professors that didn't. Especially when you mentioned something about like speaking to a wider audience. I'm not exactly sure what words you were using, but do you think using personal pronouns and stuff sort of make it more like less academic at all, or do you think that that's totally fine in philosophy?
So I've never seen any like real actual philosophy papers where it seemed like the person was trying not to use I. That's pretty common in philosophy papers. I think it's maybe less academic, but in a way that's really good because it makes it more conversational. It makes it easier to follow. It gives it a voice. I really like it. I do think if you can use it too much. So if you say, I'm going to show this, and then I'm going to show this, and then I'm going to show this, and then I'm going to conclude by saying this, you've probably used too many I's. I actually think this is something that I tend to do too much in my own writing. But I mean, I suppose it's totally possible that there are some philosophy professors who are irritated by the use of I. But I think in general, this is one of the rules that you learn in high school. Never use I, never use the passive voice, never use to be, that are good if you're trying to learn to avoid using those things, but if you treat it like a hard and fast rule, you're probably going to run into trouble. Anything else?
Maybe this is just because I'm not super familiar or at all familiar with the topic, but I did think your paper relied a little heavily on using a lot of technical terms.
Good.
Whereas you could have explained the view. And then also this might just be a difference in style, but when you're quoting, say, Watson says or so-and-so says, and I've been told that you should term that more like so-and-so claims or makes an argument rather than just states something.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I haven't heard that, but that it might be right, and it at least is a way to vary things, so you're not just saying Watson says and then Watson says and then Watson says, at least, and it may be a better way to do it. Yeah, that's good. Anything else about the final seminar paper? Yeah.
It felt like there could be some ways to just kind of tighten it up and make it a little more concise and punchy. Drive a point.
Yeah, Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Anything else? Tell you one thing I saw on the second page, at like the fourth line down, I saw that I wrote hydrolysis views us as, and that was something that I just told you not to do. And I you know, when I was a young, naive undergraduate, I didn't think about that. But this is the kind of thing that a professional philosopher will think about. A theory doesn't view things. Yeah.
Maybe in the beginning of the next paragraph, where you begin, Watson's hydrolysis seems to me to be an inadequate way to think about fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it would be better when we actually do believe something to outright say hydrolysis is an inadequate way, or hydrolysis would be an inadequate way if we think about it this way or something like that.
Yes.
But I think it puts too many conditionals.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, and I think this is something that philosophers do when they're being careful. I'm not sure I was being careful here, but philosophers tend to say this seems like, or one might think that, because we are nitpicky, and somebody can say, but what if hydrolysis doesn't do that? But I think if you use that too much or imprecisely, or when that's not what you mean, it looks weaselly. You know, hydrolysis, I thought when I was writing this paper that hydrolysis was inadequate. There's no reason to say seems to me when I actually just think that. So I think this is one of those places where something where I'm trying to weasel out of making an absolute statement looks clearly weaselly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's really good. Yeah.
It's like a good thing is that you had said in your presentation that you want to like engage with the literature, but you also, and so you don't want to make like some sort of huge, overwhelming point, but you still want it to be original and thoughtful, and that had it's just cut up, but that seems to have that intention. And if I had seen the whole thing, I'd probably think it had fulfilled that intention well. So
yeah, thanks.
Good job.
Thank you. Nice to hear something nice. Yeah, no, I mean this was like a senior level seminar on action theory. And the thing that was the most interesting to me was addiction. So then I wrote my final paper on it, and that's a relatively constrained topic with a relatively small body of literature within action theory, which helped make it a good thing to write a writing sample on. Yeah. Yeah.
To say something else nice. I was kind of, when I started reading it, I was like, I know nothing about this, but it really I could quickly figure out what was going on. And I was impressed by that, because the whole unsophisticated, stupid, mean, lazy thing. So.
I said we are.
Oh. Not you, me. But yeah, so I think just in that sense, I was very impressed how quickly I could get caught up to what was going on in the literature at that time that you were writing this.
Good. Yeah, and that's what you want. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Any last things before we move on to the second version? Okay, well, let's do that then. So if you haven't read Writing Sample, go ahead and read that now. Think about what's different, and then we'll talk about it.
Not bad.
You'd let me in again.
I'd probably at least shortlist it.
You know, taught me to do action theory when I came, and then I realized that I don't actually like it. So.
Yeah, I was gonna ask.
Yeah. I thought I might do it enough that I put it up on the website under the bios of grad students, but never thought about it since I got in.
It'd be interesting to just, and be quick to do actually, just get some statistics on how many grad students had an idea of what they want to do before they came in, and how many of them ended up actually doing that.
Yeah.
Probably collect that data pretty quickly.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I wonder. I mean, most people I can think of in my class are in the area that they thought they would be in, but not maybe working on the specific topic that they thought they'd do. Like, no, I can't think of people who like crossed from like ethics to. Except for Gil, I guess, kind of did from like ethics to philosophy of social science, but even there, it's not a huge degree. But most people are like studying the exact way they thought. Is everybody back? Missing anybody?
I think everyone's here.
Okay, well, let's get back to talking about the papers then. So, in the writing sample, things that are different, things that are better, things that are worse than the final seminar paper. What do you guys think? Yeah.
I got rid of the sentence where you said that you wanted to have a beer.
Yes, yes. I was wondering if you would pick up on that. Yeah. Yeah, I did, and while like that might have humanized me in the final seminar paper, I think it's better to avoid an example like that could rub somebody the wrong way. Yeah, so I did take that out for exactly that reason. Yeah.
It's about addictive desires,
Right. But maybe not having it be about my particular addictive desires was the right call. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
Your introduction is just so clear and straightforward, and even though I don't know anything about the topic, I know exactly like what you're going to argue. It's just
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think the introduction is better. You can see that it's shorter. You don't need it to be a long introduction. It's probably better in a lot of cases for it to be a shorter introduction. I still think that there are a couple of things that I would change in the introduction. I don't know if any of you picked up on things that you would change in the introductory paragraph. Yeah.
Well, one thing was that you said. I wrote this down. I'm trying to read my they were like it's sort of specific, but you sort of said best accounts for the problem of addiction. But like I was thinking of like what are you comparing it to? Like are you comparing it to all theories, or are you comparing it just to that one other theory? Because then you go on to say I'll develop some criticisms of the second theory and show how it can avoid these difficulties. So I wasn't sure if you were sort of just comparing the two and showing how one sort of accounts for the difficulties of the other, or if you were saying that the first was the best theory that there is and like out of all theories available.
Good, that's really good. So towards the end of the paragraph there, when I say, it's my goal to show that the volitionist theory of action, despite some difficulty, best accounts for the problem of addiction, and then I say I'm only going to introduce two competitors, you could think, how can I know that this is the best one when there are only two competitors that I'm talking about? So I could say it's better than the other one, or I could say these are the major theories that people have put forward, and this is the best between the two of those. But either of those would be clearer than what I have there. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Your first sentence in the first body paragraph stood out to me as better because you defined hydrolysis within it, or you you made it clearer why Bishop was a hydrolysis.
Good. Yeah.
As opposed to this one where you just say like where he writes about hydrolysis.
Yeah, that's really good. Why would you say where he writes about it? If somebody wants to know, they can look at the references. But otherwise, that's kind of wasted space in the paper. But defining it is not wasted space. It's really good. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot more variability in like the sentence structure. I know it's really important to us.
Yeah, and it reads better. In the first one, there are like several sentences in a row that are just Watson says quotation, Watson says quotation, Watson says. That's really boring, and it's hard to read. It really is. Yeah. No, so the variability of length and structure is important. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if this is just something that my professors drove me on unnecessarily, but towards the end of the introduction, you say you'll develop something, or you'll conclude, or you'll suggest. Instead of doing that, my professors always tell me to just say what it is that I'm doing, instead of saying that I'm going to. Just say whatever I'm trying to state without having to say that I'm going to later on.
Yes. Yes, I think that's one of the main things that I would change in the introduction. I think it's better than in the final seminar paper one. So in the writing sample one, I say, in particular, I will suggest that. So I am saying something about what I will say. And I didn't really do that in the final seminar paper. But I've done more of that. What criticisms am I developing? I will criticize this second theory for having a weird view of reasons or whatever. I will, instead of saying I will conclude by offering some suggestions, just say I will suggest, will show that desires are more complex. And maybe even say for this reason or that reason. Yeah, the less that I can say what I'm going to say and when, and the more that I just say it, I think the introduction would be stronger still. Yeah, I think that's really good. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question about that though. Isn't it still really important to lay out your structure? And in doing that, don't you kind of have to say, I will do this instead of just showing it?
Yeah, so you will, so I would take out the part where I say I will offer some suggestions. So I would say I will conclude by showing that desires are more complex. I'm saying where in the paper it's going to come, just cutting out the part where I say I'm going to do this thing, I guess, and I'm going to tell you about what that thing is, and it's coming up right now, I promise, and here it is. You know, I can cut all that out. I can give the structure, which I agree is a really, really important thing to do, especially in a writing sample, but because that's what they're looking for in the introductory paragraph. But I don't have to have so much fanfare before I get to it. Yeah. Yeah.
This isn't really common paper, but question: do you need an abstract? Is that like a necessary?
No, I don't think so. I mean, an abstract is helpful for giving somebody an idea of where stuff is in your paper. But for a paper of this length, you're going to be doing that in the introduction anyways. I wouldn't think that it would be necessary. And I think, you know, if you're pressed for space, you should have your introduction. Yeah.
And another question, not about this specifically, but are cover pages usually the norm? Like with your name, with the title, maybe your...
I didn't use one. I don't think it's common. Rick's
not
shaking
a
his
cover
head.
letter, but
Right, like a title page on the, yeah, no, I don't think that's necessary. Yeah, other stuff. Yeah.
I thought that you, Rania's advice to make more kind of topic sentences at the start of all the paragraphs, that came out a lot clearer, and it was easier to kind of know where the paragraph was going to go in detail, but that it was really clear about what its ultimate goal was.
I'll tell you something that I noticed between the two papers. If you look at the body paragraph section of the seminar paper, the paragraphs are a whole lot longer. There's one that's like over a page, and that makes it harder to read. That paragraph is really, really long. And it looks long on the page when you're reading because you don't know where it ends, and it feels long when you're reading it, and it makes more than one point. I've found as I've like progressed in writing, and also done this as a goal, I've noticed that like as I'm writing more and more drafts, the paragraphs get shorter because I'm realizing when things are distinct points, and I think trying to make your paragraphs be shorter is a good check on how far you've gotten in the progress of writing this particular paper, because it's probably a good sign that you're thinking carefully, you're separating points out discreetly, and it also makes it easier for somebody else to read. Yeah. And then you have more topic sentences, and you have more points like that where you can point people in different places in different parts of your argument. Yeah.
A question. Can you have because you're citing in your footnote, putting your citations in your footnotes rather than parenthetical citations. So can you have both though? So like parenthetical citations so you don't end up with like the string of Watson, page number, all the way down, and just leave the footnotes for elaborating on a point that would be beyond scope in the paragraph or something like that.
Yeah, that's fairly common to you. I mean, you wouldn't want to do that in the body, but you can cite things parenthetically. So you could absolutely do that. I would be cautious of too much material in footnotes, just as a general rule. I mean, I think there are times when it's really, really helpful, but yeah, I think as a general, and this is not everybody's view, that you should think, if this is important enough to say in a footnote, is it important enough to say in the body of the paper? Maybe not, but often I think it might be, or it might be unimportant enough to leave out. Yeah, but yeah, using parentheticals and footnotes together is fine. Yeah. I'll tell you one thing that I noticed about the topic sentence. So I think one thing that might be a flag that this was a paper that I wrote for a seminar and not as a paper that I wrote because I love thinking about addiction and action theory, is that I start by talking about it's difficult to provide a philosophical account of action. Okay, this was for an action theory class. That's what I cared about then. That's why I was writing the paper. But that's what I care about in this paper. I care about accounts of action, but only insofar as they can explain addiction. And so rethinking that probably would have been a good choice, because while this isn't like, since the dawn of time, man has wondered what happens when he acts, like, it still is not as on point as it could be. So that's something that I would change if I were writing this again. Something else. Yeah.
So how would you phrase your introductory sentence?
You know, that's a really good question. What would you say?
I think I would mention addiction in there to kind of bring it in a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how to word it though.
Yeah.
Is it good to start with a more like general comment about the literature sort of in the area that you're working on, or is that like a cat? Because I can see how both is.
I think you probably, in general, you probably want to avoid talking about the literature really upfront, because you want this to seem like a paper where it's your thoughts in the end that are doing the work. So, I mean, it might be, like, I didn't mention Bishop or Watson or anybody in my introductory paragraph. Maybe I could have, that probably would have been fine, but I don't think I would mention in the first sentence, Watson is, you know, says this, and I think this is better than Bishop. I don't think I would do that. That, you know, I want it to be my ideas. Yeah, Ronnie.
Not just like scratching out the whole first sentence and then the simple view of our account action suggests that.
Yeah, I think that would be stronger. I do, yeah, because we don't really need that first sentence. It's really, the work that it's doing is basically the same thing as the work that's being done in the second sentence. I think there might be ways to make it even stronger still, because the first sentence then doesn't mention addiction at all. But it's a short sentence and then you get right to addiction. But maybe something like, we don't know what happens when somebody's addicted, or something like that would be a way to get addiction right up front.
Yeah, I was going to say you could actually start in an addiction, it appears that we form judgments, and then have a way to move that sentence of simple view of our actions after that sentence. So
if we took off the first sentence, then we started with in an addiction, and then we just took that yet, stuck it on to the simple view. In an addiction, it appears that we form judgments about what it would be best to do, and then promptly do something else, yet a simple view of our actions suggests that we acquired. Yeah, that's a really great way to keep those sentences, which are fairly straightforward, but bring addiction to the fore. Yeah. What else?
Did you have a title that was not right?
Yeah, it was Addiction and Volitionalism. It wasn't a super interesting title. Yeah. I think the seminar paper was like 3 Views of Addiction or something like that. Yeah.
Titles. Some professors you just have straightforward like addiction and volitionism. Some professors like them to be ones that will stick in their head, or that are kind of catchy, or I don't know, make a play on the topic or something like that.
Snappy colon. Snappy title colon.
Yeah.
My instinct is that it's best not to do something funny in a writing sample, because sometimes when you try to be funny, it falls flat for everybody or just for a particular person. And I think I tend to find punny or funny titles more irritating than some people do. But not me, but someday maybe. But somebody like me could be the one reading your writing sample. And so a title that says Addiction and Volitionalism might make somebody fall asleep, but it might not irritate them. Where a title that tries to make a joke, you might You might get some rewards, but I think for a writing sample, the risks are probably not worth it. Which is my view, though.
In fact, there is empirical work that shows that papers that have cute titles are judged to be less serious or are taken less seriously.
It is not just my view, it is the view of science. Don't do it.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a huge effect, but it is an effect.
Yeah.
One thing that I do to like strengthen my arguments all the times is that like instead of at the end of the introduction where you say I'll conclude by offering some suggestions for strengthening. I don't even know how to really say that, but I would sort of start it as sort of refutations of attacks on it, and then defend it, and then end it with more of like an attack on, like, to strengthen your argument. I would put the refutations at the very beginning, or like the counter arguments at the very beginning of after the introduction.
So some people think that volitionalism doesn't work because, however, they're wrong because, and I will show that by showing that something like that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That could work. You want this to be. You want to show that this is controversial and interesting, but you can get past it. That might be a good strategy for showing that. Well, we're running low on time, so any other questions or thoughts about this stuff in general? Any other questions about writing samples that aren't mine? Yeah.
Sorry, I have one lingering question from earlier. Just in general, about how much time should I give my readers on my writing sample that people can criticize it to read it?
I would think. I mean, it depends on how busy they are and how much time. I think you should expect at least 2 weeks for a turnaround, and hopefully they'll be better, and maybe they'll be worse. I don't know, Rick. What do you think?
Basically, yeah, or roughly however much time they need.
Yeah.
I mean, no one wants to be pestered if they're doing you a favor, you know.
Yeah.
You said to get people to revise it who are good and up to date.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know that someone is good and up to date?
Thinking about it when I was an undergraduate, I honestly could not tell you how I would do that. I mean, I think it would be good if you had a relationship with a faculty member where you thought they would tell you if somebody who was looking at your writing sample was somebody that you could trust. Now, thinking about it now, I think, does it seem like the person is active? Like, I don't know if you have like talks at your school. Like, does that person show up? Do they participate in like activities? But also, like, looking at the syllabus, do they seem like they've read things that are recent, or is everything on the syllabus from the 70s? People are thinking about almost all of these topics, anything that you're going to read in a class, and like if you're taking an intro class, maybe that's not a good guide, because maybe all the classics in, abortion were written in the 70s, and so you're not going to have something that's accessible to intro students that's from 2013. But if you're looking at senior level classes and the person is talking about something that you think should be interesting to people now and everything is old, that might be a barometer of whether they're like up to date on what's going on. But honestly, it's hard to judge your professors when you're an undergraduate. I know people that I really liked turned out to be maybe not super up to date, and I'm not sure. So those are some tips, but good luck. That's a hard one. Yeah.
Could you go through the software?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. So I mean, I don't have a lot on any of these things, but here are some things that you can use, especially. So this Scrivener is good for big projects, which your writing sample may or may not be a big project for you. But if you've got, it lets you break up writing into chunks so that you're not dealing with a whole document at once. You know, like writing my dissertation now, like scrolling through 60 pages of Word is a pain, and that's just one chapter, you know? And so if you have a way to break something up into smaller chunks and then you can rearrange them, it also like, is a way to access different like references that you have. So that's something that you can use for a big project. Scrivener is a really good resource. I believe it's free, and I think it works for Macs and PCs, but I'm not sure. I just have a PC.
They have it for Mac. I use it.
Yeah, okay.
It's really, really good.
Yeah. Okay, so then Mendeley is a like reference management tool. So like it's more commonly used in the sciences, and there's like a social network that goes along with it that like I don't know of anyone who uses in philosophy. People do, but I think it's more commonly used in the sciences. But this is a way to like keep your references in one place, format citations in a format that you like, keep, you know, an index of your PDFs. Especially if you're working with a lot of articles, it can be, like I like to read things after they've been printed out, but it's nice to also have a place for them to be stored electronically. And so something like Mendeley is great for that. Or, similar, the one that I use is called Zotero. So it's the same kind of thing, stores PDFs, stores your references, will format anything that you put the information in for. And some websites like have a little like thing that will pull the reference into Zotero so that you don't even have to type it in yourself. I also use this to take notes on things that I read. So like I read something, I scroll notes in the margins, and then when I go back through, I say, okay, this is a really important thing about this article that I want to remember for a year from now when I'm talking about this in my dissertation. Or even like 2 weeks from now when I'm writing it down in my writing sample. I want to remember like a strength of this article was this and a weakness was this, and I want to talk about that in my whatever. So I really, really like that. It just sits in your browser and then you can open it up clear when you're ready to use it. And then the last one is the one that I know the least about, and this is LaTeX. And it's not a writing resource as much as it is like a way to format things. So if you go on in any kind of field that requires a lot of formalization or equations or anything like that, LaTeX is really good for that. So it takes, you put stuff in and you have to do a lot of commands, although there are like resources now that will let you basically type things in the way that you would in Word, and then equations or proofs or whatever come out formatted really, really beautifully. So this is super, super common in sciences, super common in math, and beginning to catch on both in like logic and areas of philosophy where there's a lot of formalization, but also just because it looks really nice. People use it in philosophy. It looks like, I don't know, it has this je ne sais quoi about it that makes it look like something that you would read in a journal and not something that you would print off in Word. And so people like looking at something that looks professional. So those are 4 software resources. I believe all of them are free. And you can find all of them. LaTeX is maybe the least accessible, both because it's hard to do this kind of markup stuff, and also because there are a lot of different programs that you can use for working with it, but it does have a really, really nice result. So those are some resources that I would suggest, maybe with varying degrees of utility for you now, but if you choose to go on, some of them could be really, really helpful.
Scrivener will export directly to LaTeX,
so
you don't have to mess with any of the markup.
Cool. So there you go, using the combination. Yeah.
Will you post this on the Google Drive?
Yes. Can you post documents? I can at least post a link to it. I thought Google didn't let you upload. Anyways, oh yeah, right. You can totally post a drive. Yeah. Yes, I will do that. Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, you're welcome to use it whenever you want. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.